understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast. I hope you are feeling well. I hope the summer has been very kind to you. And I hope that you are looking forward to returning to normality, whatever normality is in your world. In actual fact, I think it's fair to say there's very little normality anymore. And actually, we're going to talk about the lack of normality through the perception and the perspective, John, of the price of gold in a couple of minutes. But we will get there by meandering through all sorts of other ways. But how are you, Ed? All good?
I'm good. Mark, you're actually sounding and looking very chilled. I've noticed that there's a correlation between your chilledness and your hair.
Go hot.
I know you're on a bit of a detox run at the moment. It's a good thing, Mark.
24-hour detox thus far, John.
Yeah. Your hair tends to get neater as you detox. I've noticed that about you.
Well, I think my overall deportment, to use that very Victorian word, gets neater when I am detoxing. I've become much more aware of myself. And as you saw this morning, I was out for a long walk in the mountains.
Yeah.
Which
Absolutely.
is very John Davis-esque, very John Davis. It's not like me at all. I'm a metropolitan bloke. I like sort of coffee shops in busy streets.
What did you see? I hope you're out there with your notebook and your binoculars and stuff.
I looked like a 19th century anthropologist, John. I was sitting with a sort of, those Australian outback hats.
Yeah.
With the little corks on it, looking like a retired MI5 agent.
With your butterfly net.
My butterfly. No, I went for a walk up the back of the island here. What is fascinating about this part of the world, and I think you'll see it all over the Mediterranean, but particularly in parts of the world which were badly affected by blights to the vineyards in the early part of the 20th century and to the eclipse of olive farming. So this part of the world would have made its money on wine and olives. These are the two big industries here because nothing else can really grow here. And during the late part of the 19th century and early 20th century, there was a blight, not unlike the potato blight, the Prifostera infestans, right? Which affected all the wine-growing areas of Europe, from Greece to all former Yugoslavia, particularly around here, Dalmatia, Croatia, Italy, south of France, south of Spain. And it ravaged through the vineyards, through the entire industry that was wine producing collapsed. And that is the reason for Italian Americans, John, Croatian Americans, Greek Australians, etc. They left in great numbers because their livelihood was destroyed, was absolutely destroyed. And what is fascinating is the legacy of those days. And of course, the other one is the fact that olive growing used to be, again, the staple of this part of the world, but has become industrialized in other countries. And therefore, small little plots where olives used to be grown are no longer, in contrast to, for example, Spain, are no longer viable. So they have also been abandoned. And interestingly, tourism, which came to this part of the world in the 1970s and 1980s, but particularly in the 1990s, has destroyed the last remnants of the traditional industries, because the traditional industries are very hard. It's very hard to actually cultivate olives. It's very difficult. It's far easier to have an Airbnb and a B&B sign over the spare room, which is what tourism has done. It's kind of, in a way, seasonalized the workforce, number one. Number two, it's an easier dollar to make. It's an easier euro to make. But what it means for an environmentalist like you and a naturalist like you is that huge parts of the countrysides. All right, you're a naturist. Okay. Well, John, when you're not swinging your langer around al fresco and wholesale, right? Anyway, what is fascinating is it means huge swathes of the countryside have been abandoned by farming, by traditional farming over the last 40 or 50 years. And it means, therefore, if you want to walk around here, John, there are those amazing trails which were made in the last 200 or 300 years by olive farmers, by vineyard workers, to try and get the grapes and the olives down to the sea. So all these islands are a patchwork of these little trails, which are still there, right? They're slightly overgrown, but you can still walk on them. And for someone like you, it would be ideal because it means you can get into these most remote places. And because there hasn't been farmers up there annoying the plants and the animals for the last 30 or 40 years, they're unbelievably verdant and full of life now.
Fantastic.
Don't ask me what's moving around in the undergrowth or what's actually squawking in the trees, But for a generalist like myself, it's a sort of a zen sort of breath of fresh air. You go up there, there's nobody around at all. The sun is up, but it's not too hot, and you can
Yeah.
just potter around and get commune, John. You'd love it.
And is that the same kind of pressures in Croatia that the likes of Spain has been experiencing, the emptying out of Spain? Like there's huge swathes
Yeah.
of Spain that's completely empty and whole villages have been abandoned and that kind of stuff, and indeed parts of France.
Look, it's the same. It's the same process that leads to the deruralization or the ruralization, the re-ruralization of Ireland. Large parts of Ireland have emptied out. I mean, in one statistic, it best categorizes what's going on. The world's second largest agricultural exporter in total, after the United States, is amazingly the Netherlands. Now,
Right.
think about this. This is
Wow.
one of the smallest countries in the world, produces an enormous amount of agriculture. So the intensification of agriculture and the industrialization of agriculture, which the Dutch have mastered, has as its counterpart the deruralization of large parts of the Mediterranean. So, for example, you will find in a place like Croatia, tomatoes, which are actually grown in Dutch greenhouses, being sold cheaper than the tomatoes that grow naturally here in the Mediterranean,
Yeah.
right?
God, yeah.
So it's a fascinating thing. The European, and this is a part of the whole way in which globalization has changed the world, right? So as you see it in France, you see it in Spain, you see it in Italy, and of course Croatia, and all down towards Greece, is small farmers who used to be able to sell locally and make a few quid have been priced out of the market by the supply chainization of agriculture. So large supermarkets bringing in the cheapest products,
Yeah.
and the intensification and the industrialization of agriculture in the north, specifically and most evidently in Holland, where the Dutch have mastered all sorts of innovations in agriculture. Innovations in agriculture is a nice way to say shit that shouldn't grow in your back garden does, right?
Yeah.
Because you're actually using all sorts of fertilizer, using all sorts of chemicals, all that sort of stuff.
And how come that isn't happening in other countries where they could become more self-sufficient and not be subject to the nuances of supply chains?
I think, this is this ongoing major argument at the heart of economics between globalization and localization. And
Yeah.
at the moment, all supply chains, all of the food distribution, sort of food chain that we used to call it, but it's now much of a food distribution mechanism, has been driven by low cost. And low cost, of course, rewards the intensive farmer. And the intensive farmer tends to be the farmer in countries where there's a capital market that is deep, where there is resources put at agricultural development, and they can afford the capital investment, right?
Yeah.
At the same time as this is happening, you get a massive increase in tourism, the tourist industry. So you've got these two things going on at the same time. So the Mediterranean, particularly the rural parts of the Mediterranean, where like I am, have tended to go for the easy option, which is the tourist comes in
Yeah,
June and
sure.
July and August. They spend a few quid. It's easier to set up a pizzeria than cultivate olives. And that's what you do. And also, what you do is it's much easier to rent out your gaff, like it's an Airbnb. It's the Airbnbization of
yeah.
large parts of the rural Med. So tourism looks easier. But tourism in general, unless you can get the season to be elongated, i.e., the season has to start in April and has to end in December, which is very much the Spanish model, particularly in the more sophisticated Spanish areas, right?
Mm.
And of course, the parts of Italy and parts of the south of France, whereas other parts of the Med that are poorer and slightly behind only have a very intensive short season, which is like maybe mid-July to end of August.
Yeah.
And even at that, it's easier to make a quid doing that than trying to cultivate olives or trying to come up with your own wine, all that sort of stuff. So what you see all around this part of the world are two things. It's the result of the intensification of agriculture, number one, and what I would call the intensification of tourism.
Yeah.
If you think about how many people now fly Ryanair every single year, I don't know the latest figures, but it's well over 100 million. They're all short-haul flights around Europe. Lots of them are tourist-related in the summer. So what you have is this extraordinary, it's kind of slightly dystopian worldview, right? You have these parts of the
Yeah.
world become overcrowded for 2 or 3 months in the summer and then are totally undeveloped for the rest of the year. And all the while, unfortunately, skills, local knowledge, that sort of stuff disappears because, you know, when a farmer dies, the information in the farmer's head dies with him unless he
Yeah,
passes
of
it on.
course.
But if
Yeah.
his sons or daughters are running a pizzeria in town, are running, you know, a small restaurant in town and couldn't be arsed going back up the mountain to actually find out what the dad was doing or the granddad was doing,
Mm.
you know, what it becomes more like becomes more of a fetish or a kind of a niche market, this sort of what you would
Yeah.
call rural tourism. So it's something that I've noticed here over years as this island and the islands all around it gradually become denuded of people in the hinterland, and
Yeah.
everybody hangs out just around the harbor or around the seaside.
But it's also the fact that the, subsistence farming is not nearly as attractive as a tech job in a city as well for the younger folk.
Well, of course, a tech job in the city. I mean, if you're going to go that far, what I'm just talking about is the tourist option here. But of course, you know,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
smarter kids, it's the same as everywhere. It's the same as the west coast of Ireland. The smarter kids say, hold on a second, I'm going to go to wherever they go to the big city. I'm going to do a degree in this, that, and the other. And basically, this is the way in which society is developing all over the world. But it's
Yeah.
fascinating on early, like at dawn in the morning, to see the consequence of that, which is just these massive empty spaces where you can see for miles and miles and miles, and where there's literally an orchestra of sound behind you of
Yeah,
buzzing and
yeah.
bees and cicadas and all sorts of things. And then you have an economist puttering around
Wrecking
ideas
the
in his
place.
head. Yeah, wrecking everyone else's buzz, but loving his own buzz. And I was up there, John, thinking about another group of economists who are meeting just now in a place called Jackson's Hole, John, in Wyoming.
Right.
And I think
Another beautiful
Wyoming,
part of the world, actually, as well.
well, that's what I was thinking. So, John, Jackson's Hole is in Wyoming, which is just south of Yellowstone National Park, a place I believe you have been.
Yes, indeed.
And it's wedged between Idaho, Oregon, South Dakota, and Montana.
Yeah.
So you can't get more sort of American than that, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
this is the holy of holies of central bankers, monetary policy thinkers, interest rate obsessives, and their economic advisors. So this is where, over 3 days in the end of August, the New York Times has called it the most elite gathering of economists and economic thinkers in the world, right?
More than Davos.
It's basically Kilkenomics without the laughs. That's what it is. It's the same sort of idea. And much more so than Davos, because it's all the central bankers and
Yeah.
the political apparatchiks. And they are meeting today. And of course, what everybody is listening to is this sort of Delphic utterances of the head of the central bank, who is Jerome Powell. Now,
Yeah.
the idea of the Delphic utterances comes from the oracles of Delphi. And the oracles of Delphi were actually, it's interesting because the Greeks were up in this neck of the woods years and years ago. So these were the Greeks' fortune tellers who you could give over both money and sacrifices to, and they would tell you the future, right? The oracles. But the problem with the oracles of Delphi is they always spoke in riddles. So you had to decipher the riddles
Yeah,
to try
yeah,
and
yeah.
figure out the future, right?
Yeah.
And of course, what happens in most
It's
cases
like
is
Da
people
Vinci
decipher-
Code.
Exactly, Da Vinci Code for central bankers, right? And central bank watching has been described as kind of Delphic in the sense that they're kind of suggesting this and suggesting this, but they're half saying we're going to do this and half saying this. And you have to, it's like reading sort of economic hieroglyphics. You've got to figure out the whole
Yeah.
thing, right?
But
And-
why don't they just talk straight? What's the
Exactly.
problem with talking straight?
Because it's all to do with the perception of mystique. This is what I think.
Bullshit, in other words.
Precisely, right? They're trying to dress things up. As I said to me, they're guessing. Remember we did this thing a couple of weeks ago? I said, they're guessing the economic futures and the other people are guessing what the guessers make. And then the markets are guessing what the other people are guessing.
Yeah.
So, but they're all there right now, hunkered down. And you can imagine the scene in Wyoming, right? It's a place that in the winter is a very high altitude ski resort. In the summer, it has all these lakes. And of course, because it's a ski resort, the summer is full of gushing freshwater rivers.
Yeah.
All these central bankers. There's something about Americans. They like to fish. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, they do.
You know,
they do, yeah.
They do. Americans
Yeah.
will say, oh, I was out fishing with my mate Chad, right?
Yeah, yeah. And there's
Okay.
always
And
pictures of presidents out in the wilds in some idyllic area, probably surrounded by Secret Service guys in the hedges.
yeah. They love to go fishing in the summer,
Yeah.
right? And they go to these remote parts of America and they go fishing and they muse about what's happening in the economy. And Jackson Hole is the holy of holies of this, right?
But can I just ask you before you go on there, like who chose Jackson Hole and why? I can imagine everyone wants to go there because it's beautiful, but who chose it in the first place?
So bizarrely, the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas, John,
Okay.
chose it. So it was originally a symposium in the 1970s and 60s, an economic symposium organized by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas, okay, one of the 14 Federal Reserve regional banks in the United States. And then it has become basically the party to get invited to if you're into this business. And all the central bankers go and they basically decide what's going to go on in the world of money. Now, this is fascinating because it brings us on to gold, right?
Yeah.
So I describe these people in the book, Money, as the Brahmins of money. So you know the Brahmin class in India.
Yeah, in India.
So you have this caste system, and the Brahmins were the ones who understood the religious ritual and were the high priests and were the people who were mandated to talk about religion and all that sort of stuff. So I think that the central bankers are like the Brahmins, right? And they've got the same, like the Brahmins, they speak in a certain code. They also wear a certain dress. You might have known they've all got the same suits. There's a certain sort of blue central banking suit, right? They've the same dress code. They speak in the same language.
The Brahmins in India and in villages paint their houses blue.
Well, there you go. There you go, to stand out, right?
Yeah.
So there is a Brahmin caste. So I think these are the sort of Brahmins of economics, right? But because economics is so important and interest rates are so important, they get to set the price of interest rates, which is the price of money. And that's why they are unbelievably significant and yet unelected.
Yeah.
Totally and utterly. They can't lose their job if they make a mistake. And like good Brahmins, they would always come up for a reason as to why their forecast didn't work. But if you could only just get that right, don't worry, the next one will be right. So they're all there. But the interesting thing, John, for our listeners is not just the powwow of the Brahmin class and the central bankers out fishing. I feel very sorry for the salmon and trout who are being terrorized by these people, but that's another whole thing.
I'd say there's extra salmon put into the rivers so they can fish them out.
You have no doubt.
The gillies are having a laugh there.
Gillies are just booking in all sorts of farm-fed trout and salmon.
Exactly.
Anyway, Jerome Powell said in the last couple of days that interest rates in America will fall. And this is very, very important because we did a piece about 4 or 5 weeks ago on reading the tea leaves of the American economy. And I was thinking, yes, unemployment looks as if it's going up, but lots of the other indicators look okay. And also that still remains the case. However, the key thing is Powell said he will continue to raise interest rates until inflation goes to 2%. Inflation in America now is moving down towards 2. It's about 2.3, 2.4. And what he's basically said, look, you know what? Inflation's on its way down. So my other mandate is to keep the economy going. So I'm going to cut interest rates. Now, of course, that will embolden financial markets, right? Number one. And number two, that will probably be quite good for the incumbent in the presidential election, because at a time when interest rates are falling, if interest rates are falling quicker than unemployment is rising, you can spin that as, look, your mortgage is coming down under my tenure.
But at the same time, the unemployment figures, what do they call it?
The non-farm payroll or the rate of unemployment,
So they're softening.
Yeah.
So what does this drop in interest rate, how will that affect the employment figures?
Well, I mean, of course, the idea is that, you cut interest rates. That encourages people to save less, to spend more, companies to invest more. And over time, that kicks the economy forward and the rate of unemployment falls, right? That's the theory.
Yeah.
And, broadly speaking, that has been the case since time immemorial. In the medium term, in the very short term, what it does is it just changes the background noise, right? The symphony behind the election campaign can now be rising stocks, rising prices. Look, aren't we creating wealth? And we're doing a very good job for you. Now, conspiracy theorists will say that it's not surprising that the Fed will cut interest rates going into a presidential cycle because Donald Trump has been on record, well, he's been on record saying everything, but he's been also
Yeah.
on record as saying he thinks the Fed is a problem, and he's in the camp of the Bitcoiners and the gold bugs and all these people, that basically he believes that the American institutions, the government of which the Federal Reserve is part of, the broad macro institutions of the United States, are corrupt. They are the elite, drain the swamp, etc.
Yeah.
So his
Yeah.
populist, part of his populist appeal is basically pointing the finger at they. Do you know, he always says they,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
including in they is anybody who is a bureaucrat or in the government or any of that. It stems largely from, I think Ronald Reagan said, the 7 most terrifying words in the English language is, "Hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you."
Yeah.
That was one of his opening, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So it all comes from that idea.
He was actually a great campaigner, actually. In fairness,
Amazing campaigner.
yeah. I didn't
Amazing
agree with
campaigner.
a lot of his stuff, but he was brilliant. He was funny as
He's
well.
a great communicator, self-deprecating, funny, and hard as nails as well.
Yeah, shit actor though.
Yeah, but very good trade union organizer. That's the amazing thing. He was a trade union organizer for actors.
Was
who
he?
turned his
I didn't know that.
Yes, that's where he started. Is the Actors Guild. Yeah. And then of course he turned his back on the acting. In fact, if you want to see, I know people mock the movie now, but if you want to see a great snapshot of the interaction between Wall Street, finance, trade unionism, and the economy, the actual movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas is really well worth. Martin Sheen, Charlie Sheen,
Oh, that
Michael
was a
Douglas.
brilliant movie. Yeah,
And
that
the
was
storyline is the storyline
Yeah.
of America in the late 80s.
so
It's a
80s.
really,
Brilliant.
yeah, who doesn't like the 80s, John? Who doesn't like the 80s? So to get back, Powell has said, look, the world is a little bit dangerous. Unemployment is rising. I'm not that worried about inflation. We're going to cut interest rates quicker. Now, what that has done is kicked off a discussion on the momentum behind the gold price. So you were asking me a couple of minutes before we came on air.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about gold, Mac, but let's talk a little bit more about that after this. Mark, we've actually been talking about all sorts of stuff, including agriculture and wine and olives and
Commodities,
the whole
John,
shebang.
agriculture, gold, things that are in the ground.
But I've been reading quite a bit over the last while about gold. One of my best mates, Joe, I would refer to him as a doomsday prepper.
Yes.
He's got a big position in gold, as they say. But I've been looking at gold and the gold market of late because there's lots been written about it.
Yeah.
From a couple of angles. One is the price is shooting up. It hit 2,500 per ounce there recently, which is a record. And that's up from kind of 1,700 back in 2020.
Right, okay.
And actually, that's up from $279 back in 2001, which is quite incredible. But that's one thing. Also, I was reading that countries like China, Russia, Turkey have doubled their buying of gold in the last couple of years. I was kind of, what is going on with gold? And what's with the sudden, well, it seems like a sudden interest in hoarding gold.
Okay. This is a big issue, right? I'm going to answer the Russia, China, Turkey one straight away, right? And
Yeah.
I'm going to start with Turkey. The reason the Turks have been buying gold is the Turkish exchange rate, the lira, has probably been one of the most volatile outside of the Argentinian peso in the world, right? And say volatile, not volatile in a good way, volatile in a bad way. It's been falling rapidly. For a long time, Erdogan had this bizarre idea that cutting interest rates would push the exchange rate up, when everybody knows that cutting interest rates pushes the exchange rate down. But his idea was that cutting interest rates would eventually create the conditions for an increase in the demand for money. And that would increase the demand for the lira, and that would push up the lira.
Right.
But that was a very idiosyncratic, very unusual worldview. So all the while, what happened in Turkey was people began to see their savings eroded in their own currency as the currency continued to fall. So Turkish people decided, okay, what is a hedge against this delinquent policy of our government? We're going to buy gold. And they have bought gold in huge numbers. Then Erdogan changed position, sacked the old central bank about 12 months ago, sacked the old head of the central bank 12 months ago, and got in an orthodox central banker. And she decided the only way that they could actually establish some sort of foundation under the currency was to actually increase their reserves. So to continue to buy up dollars, assets, but mainly gold
Right.
as an alternative. So the Turkish story is quite specific. Remember we used that word sui generis, John?
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Okay, so the Turkish one is sui generis, which is basically unique to him, right?
Yeah.
Okay. However, the Chinese and the Russian thing is different. The Chinese and the Russians want gradually to dethrone the American dollar as the reserve currency of the world.
Yes, this
It's not-
de-dollarization I keep hearing about.
It's not their first policy. It's not what keeps them up at night. It's not what they orientate their entire economies towards. But as a byproduct of this new Cold War, what they have decided to do is chip away at the hegemony of the United States dollar as the number one currency in the world. And how do they do this? They would love to do this by forcing or compelling or coaxing people to buy their currency, the renminbi or the ruble. But nobody wants to do that, really.
Yeah,
You're not getting
yeah.
people saying, oh, I'm long the ruble and I'm long the renminbi, right? What they, like your friend Joe, who has got a large position in gold, right? Okay. So what they do is they are just basically selling dollars in the reserves for gold. And so what you see is that they're both countries are acquiring gold, right? There is also in both China and much more specifically in India, a real demand for gold. So Chinese and Indian people, mainly through jewelry, John, actually, mainly through
Yeah.
jewelry, are gold hoarders. They have always been. I remember I told you that the Indians have been loving gold for thousands of years. I remember I mentioned to you that Pliny the Elder in Rome complained about the fact that Roman gold was going to India because the Indians didn't want anything the Romans actually produced except for wine. And the Romans wanted everything the Indians produced. They wanted pearls, they wanted spices, they wanted diamonds, they wanted emeralds, they wanted
Silk,
everything.
yeah.
And amazingly, cloth and cottons and muslins and everything. So basically, in Rome, pre-Pompeii, if you wanted to have your flyest shit on, it came from India, right? If you were a Roman version of a rapper or Kim
Yeah.
Kardashian or somebody on the red carpet going to the Oscars, you were kitted out in Indian clobber.
Super crazy fly.
Super crazy fly, exactly. But the Indians had no interest in buying Roman shit because they thought it was really second rate,
Yeah.
except for wine. They quite like garlic. But what they did, so the Romans have to exchange gold for all this fly stuff. And Pliny the Elder complained that India was becoming the graveyard of Roman gold because the Indians kept hoarding it. And why did they hoard it? Because they used it in their temples.
Yes, of
So they
course.
wanted to use they used it as decorations, right? So it has been ever thus. The Indian demand for gold has always been outside. So right now, you have that geostrategic play going on. However, there's something also going on, which is what your friend with the large position in gold is feeding into, which is the gold has always been a bet on Armageddon.
Yeah.
If you believe the world is going to end, if you believe the financial system is on the verge of cataclysmic collapse, if you believe the new world order of American hegemony, the European Union underpinned by institutional solidity, human rights, all that sort of stuff. If you believe that's coming to an end because you're worried about a war in the Middle East, or you're worried about Russia, or you're worried about China having to go with Taiwan, your default position is to buy gold. So this increase in the price of gold from
Would
1700
beans not be better though in times of Armageddon? I have a big position in beans.
Oh, beans. I thought you said bees. I was going to say, all those books have been really famous, like the bookkeeper of Istanbul, the tattooist of Auschwitz. You could have the beekeeper of Stillorgan, which could be you.
No, this is bachelor's beans.
Bachelor's beans. Sorry, I wasn't aware that your interest in commodities went to such fundamental and granular levels. So, but anyway, John, the interesting thing is when you see the price of gold increasing over a significant period of time and gradually going up and up and up, it is what is called the return of the gold bug. Now, the gold bug has always been with us. The gold bug is an Armageddonist. And there's always been a great market in Armageddon. This is what I've always thought as a general rule in life. If you're in the prognostication business, it's always better to say the crash is around the corner than say, do you know what? Everything will be grand.
Yeah.
Everything will be grand doesn't really cut the mustard. The Armageddonist idea is like, this is as old as the Bible, right? You go out into the wilderness Remember we spoke about John the Baptist last week? And you go out in your loincloth and you starve yourself for 40 days and you scream the end of the world,
Yeah.
right? But what actually happens, the world usually doesn't end. Usually what happens is we muddle through.
Yeah. There's a correction of some sort. Yeah.
There's a correction, but the humans are actually programmed for a certain amount of casual optimism. I think that's why we get out of bed every day. But there has always been the cult of what I would call endism. There was an amazing book, one of the biggest selling books of the end of the 19th, early 20th century, was a book called Degeneration by a fellow called Max Nordau. And this book kind of collated lots of thinking of loads of writers, Ibsen, Richard Wagner, Nietzsche, even Oscar Wilde.
Yeah.
It was all this idea about degeneration, that the basic premise is that society and human beings are degenerating, and that ultimately this degeneration is going to manifest itself in some cataclysmic disaster. Now, the interesting thing is you can say that Nordau was kind of preempting or forecasting, or at least putting people on watch about fascism and communism and Nazism, because it's a whole lot of sort of social engineering and this sort of stuff. But the interesting thing is that people like to read about disasters. And we seem to be, because we are programmed more. It's like, for example, if you have a review of this podcast and you get 5 reviews saying, "Oh, the podcast is really good and interesting," and one fellow, "That podcast is shite," right?
Yeah.
The podcast is shite one sticks in your mind. You discount all the good ones, right? But you actually elevate and in some way dignify the bad ones, because in some way we're programmed to accept danger and negativity more, because I suppose in an evolutionary sense, it's probably better to be aware of bad things that threaten you than to be cognizant of good things, because good things can't kill you.
Prepared. Yeah.
Right. So that's
hence doomsday preppers.
Doomsday preppers, exactly.
Yeah.
So of course that's what drives not just gold, but also the Bitcoiners. The Bitcoiners was originally a bet on Armageddon. They said the world is going to end, the financial system is absolutely corrupted, and these Brahmins that we spoke about actually in Jackson's Hole, they are the problem. They are the elite. They are manufacturing money. They are manipulating money, and only through precise money that can't be manipulated can we have salvation. It's a very sort of, have you ever heard of the rapture, John?
I have, yeah.
That fundamental Christian idea that the day of reckoning is coming. It's the same sort of idea.
Yeah.
There's the reason the day of reckoning is so fertile in people's minds as a sort of an image is that it kind of wraps things all up in a clean ending. You know the way people say closure? Well, that's fucking closure if you want it. The rapture, right? That's the end of days, okay?
That kind of epitomizes closure.
And this sort of lexicon has bled its way into and seeped into economics, so that lots and lots of people see economics as almost a morality play. So if a government is overspending and if society is consuming and if the economy is growing, this is a sort of an immoral act. This is a sort of act of delinquents and people who don't take the future seriously. So what we should always do is save much more and be prudent. And this is the path to righteousness, which is a very Calvinistic worldview.
Right.
And of course, then this is all informed by the sense of the rapture, that at some stage the world is going to end, there's going to be a big bang, and God is going to go down from heaven and smite out his enemies, right? Now you take that logic and you apply it to economics, and that is the sort of thing that fuels the gold bug. So you will find in America in particular a very, very significant overlap between evangelical Christians and both Bitcoin and gold obsession. But now, of course, the Bitcoiners and the golders, the Bitcoiners used to say, "Don't worry, Bitcoiner is digital gold," which, again, it's not a bad marketing spiel. But now what you realize is the Bitcoiners and the gold bugs are actually now enemies, because the Bitcoiners are saying, "We're a better hedge than gold against gold." And the golders are saying, "We're a better hedge." And what the gold people are saying is gold has the advantage of being acquired by jewelry and ornamentation. That gives us its value, that people will always wear gold.
But also in the tech world as well, it's quite valuable. But that kind of hoarding, whether it's gold or Bitcoin or whatever, is also kind of anti-economic growth. Because if you're hoarding all this, you cannot spend or you cannot
Exactly.
invest.
It's what I call the I'm all right, Jack approach to economics.
Yeah.
We'll be fine. And out there's a big day of reckoning, and that big day of reckoning is going to destroy everything. And in a sort of a Mad Max dystopian afterworld, we will emerge as the people with all the shekels.
Yeah.
That's really it.
Yeah.
And that the rest of the world is being in some way hoodwinked by these Brahmins of money that are in Jackson's Hole, that are fueling the financial markets that we're talking about in this podcast. And those people are evil and they are undermining us. And how are they undermining us? They're undermining us with inflation, because inflation chips away at our savings.
Yeah.
But that only makes sense if you have savings.
Yeah.
If you don't
true,
have savings, you don't care, right? So what you find is that a lot of people in the gold world are probably reasonably well off themselves. And if
Yeah.
you go back in the history of money and the history of bimetallism and the history of expansionary monetary policy, what you always find is this conflict at the heart of the system. The Americans, as I told you before, had even a general election in 1896 on this very issue.
Yeah.
And of course, that is the basis of the Wizard of Oz story in the book. But it's all about bimetallism. Do we have a gold standard or a silver standard?
But is there a real threat to the dollar because of this gold hoarding and increased buying by these nations?
If you look at the dollar, right, you have to take the view that right now the dollar is preeminent. But you also have to take the view that the currency that is the currency of 4% of the world's population, which is really all America is, big and all as it is highly unlikely to be the global reserve currency indefinitely.
Yeah.
So that's a basic sort of fact, right? Probably the warning from history for the dollar is sterling. So sterling was the preeminent currency in the world up until the First World War.
Yeah.
And then what happened was the Brits fighting the First World War ended up having to borrow enormous amounts of money from the Americans. So the Brits ended up, after the First World War, having gone from the creditor nation of the world, where sterling was preeminent, to a significant debtor nation, where the Americans became the creditor nation. And pretty much coincident with that, what you see is the gradual fall of sterling. Number one, as the world's reserve currency, but then number two, is a store of value in and of itself. And sterling has been falling almost on an annual basis. If you were to do a slide rule over the dollar sterling rate since, let's say, the late 1920s until now. So that gives you a sense of the preeminent trading nation with extraordinary links around the world, with an empire, with incredibly deep capital markets, i.e. Britain, centered on London, gradually becoming a country that I think had to come to terms with the end of that empire. And maybe the most visible leading indicator was the gradual, not collapse, but the gradual fall in the currency. And why did it fall? Because there was a gradual fall in the demand for sterling. And why there was a gradual fall in the demand for sterling? Because eventually the world said, you know what, we'll take the dollar. So, over 100-year view, there's no doubt that currency like the dollar will have to find its position in the context of other currencies. And I presume the currency of China will be the main one to win as the Chinese economy grows and grows and grows. But, is there an imminent collapse of the dollar in the next 12 months, as the gold books say? I can't see it. I cannot see that. But it doesn't matter. If enough people believe it, the price will still go up. This is the same thing as Bitcoin. I've always said Bitcoin, fill your boots if that's what you want to do. Be a Bitcoiner, go on Twitter and shout and roar about freaking red eyes and all that malarkey, right? But is there a case for this thing to become the global reserve currency? No way. Just no way. Because it's not money, but it is something. And is there a case for gold to keep going up? Yeah. And what keeps Bitcoin and gold going up is enough people believe it. And if enough people believe it, the prices continue to firm. And ultimately, I think that's what's going on. I don't think, John, and it's interesting, we leave it at there. Remember you were mentioning the iPhone and the dissemination of messages and information and all that last week, right? I think the proclivity for anxiety about the end of the world is not only a function of real dangers, which there are out there. There's dangers of war, of immigration, of economic slowdown, all those things we talk about. But there's also the cacophony of various messages that are hitting people And the idea that I've always said, because humans are more likely to react to bad rather than good news, bad news at a time when everybody is a messenger can cultivate, and I use the word cultivate, can actually cultivate cults, belief systems, quasi religious approaches to the world, which manifest themselves in economics in things like gold bugs. That is part of the beauty of economics, John. That's what I'm saying. It's a bit like, when you go out the back of the island here and you listen to different birds and you think it's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you think
Yeah.
this is diverse and this is wonderful and isn't this fascinating? I think the same thing of the various cults in economics, right? I think the worst thing is to be monotheistic, to have one faith. I think what makes economics so fascinating is we have many cults, we have many subgroups, we have many Brahmins, we have many, many, many religions, and that's what makes the world go round.
All with their own call.
Exactly, John. Exactly. We'll talk to you next week.